All right, so now we've gone ahead and done the process of getting a low-res version of my mesh, and we've added subdivision levels, and we took our high poly target and projected our details back onto this low-res mesh. It just has multiple subdivision levels now. So it has the low poly, which we're going to use in our 3D scene or inside of our 3D file, in like Maya or Blender, and then it has also higher subdivision levels, all the detail, which we're going to bake out into texture maps. But in order to bake it out to texture maps, we're going to need UV unwrapping on our low-res mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to export this out. So I'm going to bring it all the way down to its low-res, lowest subdivision level. I'm going to come down here to export, and if you're in an older version of my Zbrush, there's going to be some other buttons here that say like merge and group and some other things. If you're in a newer version, it's going to look like this, and usually everything's going to be great if you have a newer version of ZBrush. But I'm going to show you what the preferences look like, and it's important to note this preference and just be aware of it. So if you're going to export it as an OBJ, you want to check this. It'll either show up here in an older version of ZBrush, or it's going to show in your preferences in newer versions. We'll go Preferences, Import Export, and there's this button right here, Group, Export Subgroups button. So whenever OBJ is in a format selected, determines whether areas of mesh will be exported as separate items with group assignments or as a single group. We want this almost always to just be turned off. So just be aware that if you export your OBJ, you open it in Maya, and it's like comes in as a bunch of different meshes for some reason that are separated, you need to come back into ZBrush and turn this off. So it's in the newer versions, it's in here. In the older versions, it's down in the Export tab. So once we've done that, we're going to go up to our tool palette. We're going to export our model. So we're going to go ahead and export. I'm going to export it as an OBJ. Say yes. So I just named it Plank Low Res. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that model into Maya. And here I've just gone ahead and file imported it. What's important to consider is that it's a good idea to, like, this is like came in really tiny. And in some cases, yours might come in like in a weird spot, depending on how you've been using ZBrush. Whatever happens, my recommendation is for now, before you, until you bring this out back into ZBrush and re-import it back in, don't mess with its position and scale. Just leave it exactly as it comes in ZBrush. Just so we can UV, or inside of Maya, so we can UV unwrap it and then export back out. And then you can go ahead and center it and do whatever you want to make it more friendly for layout or friendly for your 3D scenes. So I brought this in, and you can see I've already UV unwrapped it, but I'm going to go ahead and, it's going to come in with no UVs, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Create Planar. And in this case, so I'm just did create planar just so we can have some UVs. I always start with planar because then I'm going to just go ahead and cut pieces off and then start unfolding them. Something to keep in mind with Z-Remesher is that, in this case, that actually turned out being really good, and I'm going to use that in a second, but I can click on this one. You'll see Z-Remesher often gets spiraling topology. That means edge loops that don't necessarily connect back on themselves. They're edge loops that connect to new edge loops, and then they kind of spiral in really complicated ways. This makes UV unwrapping kind of challenging sometimes. That's why we want to go for as low as we can. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but Z-Remesher can be manipulated to give you better topology and give you more predictable results like edge loops that connect back onto themselves. But in this case, for the sake of time, I'm not going to try to do that and manipulate Z-Remesher too much. So I do luckily have this edge loop that goes all the way around. I'm just going to cut this up in a way that it's going to lay out flat with as little surface distortion as possible. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to cut it in half and then cut the corners because the three-dimensional corners almost always have a hard time unfolding. So you can see that part was starting to wrap around and spiral, so I'm just going to manually get this to cut across from one edge to the other edge, right to here. You can see when I click on that, it's going to continue that way, but I want to stop right there. I just want these edges to, these corners to unfold a little bit nicer. And I'm not going to worry too much about texture seams personally because I'm going to be doing this in Substance Painter and I'm going to primarily be like painting my details. If we're going to do like something UV based, like some kind of pattern, and we wanted to lay it out, then we need to make sure our UVs are a little bit more considered, right? Because our texture seams are going to show up this way, and it might not show up in a place where I like them, but in this case, I'm not going to worry about it too much. So I'm going to come over here. And so I'm going to go ahead and cut this. So I'm going to press Shift X over in the UV tab window to go ahead and cut those. Take those UV shells. I'm going to go ahead and grab them. We're going to go ahead and lay them out. Oops, sorry, unfold them. Sorry, first I'm going to unfold them. See, there's an area I missed, so I'm just going to come in here and cut that, so Shift X. And then do the same thing, come in here, go ahead and unfold those. And I can spend more time making this pretty and worrying about making my UVs better. But for brevity, I'm going to go ahead and click on Layout just to get these packed into one UV tile and make sure they're not overlapping. If I was to do like a multi-asset, right, like let's say I had like a bridge or a fence of all these planks, right, I would want to consider, before I went through this whole process of bringing it back into Zbrush, I would want to consider how to optimize those assets together in the UV space. So, I might want to have this, scaled in, brought up to here. Let's say I had about 20 different planks here, right, that all had unique UVs and unique models, right? I might not want to have a separate texture map for every single plank because that can get kind of unmanageable. So I might want to go through this process of, taking all my planks and going through the ZRemesher and exporting them and then UV unwrapping them inside of Maya before I bring them back into Zbrush. Because I might want to UV unwrap them together and know how their UV shells should match together. So if that's the case, I would go ahead and save this file and then continue on exporting and bringing in new planks into the same file and then lay them all out together. But in this case, I'm just going to treat it as a single one-off asset. So another thing to keep in mind is this whole workflow is going to work great, assuming I didn't actually make a change to my model. We could make a change to the model, and I'll probably cover that later. But for the most part, I'm just going to assume that I didn't have to make any changes to my model inside of Maya while I was in here. So let's go ahead and name this. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to name it Plank A. So we're going to name it Plank A because I'm going to have like, say, 4 planks or 5 planks. I'm going to do File, Export Selection, Plank A, Low Res, and I'm going to save this file, so Save Scene. So we'll come back in here. Here, this one's, I'll go ahead and rename it now, just so we know, Plank A. So I'm going to now need to bring in that UV unwrapped version of this plank. So I need to make sure I'm on the subdivision level that is the same as I exported it at. So I exported it as subdivision level 1. So I need to make sure I jump down to subdivision level 1 on this object. And assuming I didn't change my mesh in Maya, I'm just going to go ahead and go File, Import, and we're going to bring in Plank A. Click on Open. And you can't tell the difference, but what it's done now is it's replaced this object, the lowest subdivision level, with a UV unwrapped version of it. And all the subdivision levels are still there. If they weren't there, I would have to do some projection, like reprojecting again, like where I duplicate it, project it again, just like I did in this tool over here. But if we done it right and nothing weird happens, then it should bring in our model with the UVs. And also kept all our subdivision levels. So now our mesh has UVs, our lowest resolution, and we can now use the multi-map exporter to export out texture maps.